Welcome to the 7th NDRF Weekly Review, bringing you a roundup of news you maybe missed every week until the Scottish independence referendum in September. This week we found out where the campaign funding is coming from, more stories of intimidation, and why Scottish lives are worth less. But first, this week, more concerns are raised over the future of the NHS if we vote no. A video featuring Dr. Philippa Whitford from Women for Independence was released this week, with Whitford stating that in 5 years, England won't have an NHS, and if we vote no, Scotland won't have one either in 10. Dr. Philippa Whitford is a consultant breast surgeon with considerable experience of working within the NHS. Links to her full video can be found below. Now, concerns over the NHS recently have led to the founding of the NHS for Yes group, who actively oppose the privatisation of the NHS in England and know that, should it continue, the amount of money allocated for health spending in Scotland will gradually fall away too, as more contracts are put out to private bidders who don't always have the best track records for safety or quality of care, but are certainly the cheapest. Dr. Willie Wilson, co-founder of NHS for Yes, stated that in Scotland we are not going down this road, but the more Westminster cuts Scotland's budget and the more the state withdraws from direct NHS provision in England, the greater Scotland's budget will be squeezed as a consequence because of the way the Scottish Parliament is funded. Now, some folks aren't aware that matters concerning the NHS in Scotland are currently devolved to the Scottish Parliament, with its funding being raised by Scottish taxpayers. It's the reason that prescription charges are still free in Scotland but not in England. However, Ed Miliband has recently voiced that he would like to reintroduce prescription charges to most adults if he could. But let's have a look back at the last public institution to be privatised by the Westminster government. The Post Office. 60% of the Post Office was floated last October, and new reports this week have shown that it was undervalued by £1 billion, effectively costing the taxpayer money. But here's the thing, in the run-up to the sell-off, Lazard, one of the organisations in charge of the evaluation, appointed an ex-Tory minister as its London chairman who oversaw the evaluation. Immediately after the sell-off, Lazard bought stock at the undervalued price, then sold it off as soon as it spiked to its actual value, making a nice profit of £8 million. It kinda looks like Westminster might be selling off public institutions and making a nice profit for their friends. Of course, all this seems especially relevant at the moment as the largest public sector strike in 3 years is taking place in England over pay cuts in the public sector, as MPs give themselves an 11% pay rise. Things aren't likely to change anytime soon either. Recent polls show that the Tories are still leading for the 2015 general election. But what is even worse is that they indicate there is no way there will be a majority government. At best, we could have a Labour-Lib Dem coalition who are committed to austerity and privatisation. However, a Conservative UKIP coalition is currently ahead by 10 points, who are also committed to austerity and further privatisation. Since Scotland has so few representatives at Westminster due to differences in the size of our country compared to England, there is literally nothing we can do to stop this. Unless we vote yes, obviously. This week, the Electoral Commission released an update on those who have been donating to both the Yes and No campaigns. The No camp shouted that they had had more donations, which is true. But these figures only relate to donations over £7,500. So the No camp is being funded by the rich. Look a little further and you start to get an idea of exactly who is funding the No campaign. Mostly rich bankers, landowners and lords. People who may find their positions challenged in an independent Scotland, not those who really have the interest of Scotland at heart. And all this after Blair McDougall, head campaigner for Better Together, was complaining about being the apparent underdog. Now, of those making donations to the No campaign, there are a bunch of very shadowy organisations, some registered to an 8-bedroom house along with many other equally hard to find businesses. And of course, bankrolling the No camp, we also have the Stowbury trustees, who include Robert Edward Peter Marquis of Salisbury, Robert Michael James Cecil Peer of the Realm, and Ulrich David Barnett, a man who actually lists his occupation as a gentleman. Is it surprising that many of those donating are currently sitting in the House of Lords? Members of the House of Lords are paid £300 per day and have all of their food, drink and houses covered at the expense of the taxpayer. So no, it isn't surprising that they've identified Scottish independence as a threat to their cushy lives at the expense of others. Meanwhile, I think it's fair to say that Yes Scotland receiving less is for two very clear reasons. First of all, It's the people's movement, and not all of us have over $7.5 grand to throw away. And secondly, Yes Scotland is one organisation of hundreds, each receiving funding from many people and who are running their own projects, such as National Collective and Business for Scotland. This week we saw again the face behind the campaign to keep us in the UK, and it wasn't one with much concern for the future of Scotland. This week on Project Fear, the ongoing campaign to keep you scared of independence, I don't even know where to begin, so let's condense it. Amid claims that the SNP have been intimidating businesses into keeping silent about independence, the chief executive of the Scottish whisky industry has come forward to say that there has been no intimidation by the Yes camp of the whisky industry, as was reported. This was just after Anton Muscatelli, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Glasgow, came forward and stated that there had been no intimidation of academics either. Next, The Telegraph ran a story that National Savings and Investment would bar Scottish investors after a yes vote. Turned out to be a lie, and they had to correct it. Next, the BBC reported that President-elect of the EU, Jean-Claude Juncker, stated that one does not become a member of the EU simply sending a letter in relation to Scotland. Well, wrong. He was talking specifically about a letter sent by the Catalan president outlining their desire for independence and entry to the EU. So, more misrepresentation of facts from the BBC. In the same week that Professor Sinead Douglas-Scott, a professor of European and Human Rights Law at Oxford University, has said that entry to the EU is assured. Next, Reform Scotland, a right-wing free market think tank with close ties to the Unionist parties, has had one of their board members, Professor Donald Mackey, come forward and state that the UK's predictions for oil in Scotland were about £8 billion lower than it should be, and criticised Danny Alexander's poor grasp of numbers. So, looks like we're still good for oil. Oh, and nobody reported it. Even though that $8 billion would effectively wipe out Scotland's inflated deficit that the No Camp keep talking about. And done. And now onto the final section, it's the fact of the day. This week, the Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament reported on 20 military vehicles driving along the M74 and through the centre of Glasgow carrying Trident nuclear bombs. Glasgow is only Scotland's largest city and home to 600,000 people, so no big deal. Estimates say that the trucks were likely carrying 6 100-kiloton nuclear bombs. The bomb dropped in Hiroshima was only 16 kilotons. But Scottish lives are worth less than those further south. Trident is located only 40 miles from Glasgow, but can't be moved south because, as the Ministry of Defence puts it, it would endanger too many lives, and concluded that in the event of a disaster up here, societal contamination would be okay. But hey, for 30 years the Ministry of Defence also fired depleted uranium into the Solway Firth in Kirkcudbright from nearby tank testing sites. There's about 30 tonnes of depleted uranium in Scottish waters that's been linked to cancers, birth defects, illness of the brain, kidney and lungs. Only 1.9 tonnes were fired by British forces during the entire Iraq War, to give you some context. In 1974, it was pointed out that this was actually breaking the law, so they changed the name. Now they weren't firing shells, they were just placing them. That got them round it. After all, it's only Scotland. Still think we're better together? That's everything from this week's IndieRef Weekly Review. Check out my IndieRef special report on the UK government's recent booklet that they sent out to every house in Scotland, links below. I'll be bringing you your weekly roundup every week from now until the referendum in September. You can send me questions and stories to indierefcommunity@gmail.com and follow me on Twitter at StephenPayton134. Thanks for watching, please share, like and subscribe. I will not see you all next week as I will be away, so there won't be a video, I'm sad to say, but I will be back the following week. And remember folks, don't hate the media, become the media.